kind of speed do you do? Well, we get wound up with almost 50 miles an hour. Some sunscreen, the airshow is about to begin.
EAA would like to thank Jim Slattery of San Diego, California, for sponsoring this year's state-of-the-art sound system. It's time for the noise, the excitement, and the thrill that only the EAA Airventure can provide. It's time for the world's finest air show, sponsored by Rockwell Collins.
USSR. As you can see, taking the lead of the airplane, of that element, and pulling up, that's our gleaming F-86. That's Steve Curry. He'll go out and start a solo routine as the other three individuals pass. I want you to look at the sweep of the wings. That was a key to success in jet aircraft. It's a 35-degree sweep, just about the same sweep as its adversary in the Korean War. Well, there was something that happened in an airplane like the one coming in from your left about 6 months later out at Muroc, as it was called back then. You know it as Edwards Air Force Base now, home of the right stuff. Test pilot from North American Aviation, George Welch, went into a shallow dive over the speed of sound. Now that was kept secret for a long time. Look to the right as the three-ship element of the check jets, as they're called, come in tight formation. This aircraft replaced one you're going to see later called the L-29. About the era of the mid-1970s or so, that particular airplane, they kept it quiet for a long period of time because they didn't want to take the glory away from General Yeager and the Bell X-1. But it was the revolutionary sweep of the wings in that jet that was going to mark success in the dogfight arena. That was shared by the Russians in the MiG-15 because we both got that data from captured German aeronautical data. With the F-86 out of sight, right away in tight formation, the L-39s come back in their flight, filling up the sky. Now, you remember the fall of the USSR. It was that point in time that these airplanes, both in their piston-powered and the airplanes, were exquisite as well. This is one of the products that came to the U.S. There are approximately 157 of these in North America, the F-86 Sabre jet. Now that Sabre jet that's going from your left to your right, gleaming in the sun, 50, over the Yalu River, there was a dogfight between a P-80 Shooting Star, a Lockheed jet, and a MiG-15. The Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star shot down the MiG-15, and that created history. Our hoppers have set up for the solo or in-trail pass. Inexpensive to buy, reliable jets with ease of maintenance, two-seat capability, and dependable aircraft. Now we have two jet teams that fly an air show schedule in the United States using these type of aircraft, one based on the East Coast and one based on the West Coast. So that gives you an idea of how reliable this is. Much success. Look low and to your right again at former F-15 pilot Steve Currick, call sign Puck. As he goes straight upstairs like a homesick angel. Bob Hoover had extensive testing in this aircraft, extensive demonstrating to the airmen this new concept called the jet. All right, with the hoppers now getting ready to land, on the takeoff roll is an extension of that P-80 Shooting Star by Lockheed, which saw action in Korea in the jet war, but because it didn't have the swept-back wings, it just didn't have the speed and maneuverability that the F-86 did. For the most part, the P-80 Shooting Star built by Lockheed as one of the first jets to enter combat was in fact relegated to ground attack service. Now, the end of the day of that airplane, 5 years later, the Canadians were still using them. Why? Because they couldn't find a suitable replacement. The airplane did everything. Low it to your right now. As our next contingent of aircraft coming in, you look at the tip tanks, you look at the two-place fuselage, and the relatively stretched fuselage as well compared to the P-80 Shooting Star. The L-39, the jet jet, made by Aero Vodahody. Approximately 7,000 pounds of thrust in those Russian jets. By the way, while we're talking about jets, our honored guest here watching, General Dan Cherry has written. It's called "My Enemy, My Friend." Oh boy, what a book! You might have heard him in some of the symposiums. You might have heard him in the Warbirds in Review. You might have heard him over our PA system, and we had an interpreter for Hong Mi, who was telling us about the dogfight. Hong Mi was flying the MiG-21, the supersonic jet, and General Dan Cherry, now retired, was flying the F-4 Phantom. So the enemies are now friends. They are close friends. And wow, what a story that is. If you could get it, get your hands on it. It's called "My Enemy, My Friend," written by retired Brigadier General Dan Cherry. What a story that is. And how neat that Hong Mi, who was one of the jets of the correct configuration and aerodynamic features, had over 100-mile-an-hour advantage on the piston-powered aircraft. But initially, starting at the end of World War II, jets were a mystery. They were not very reliable. They burned way too much gas. They needed to be developed. And I've got to tell you this, there were many a combat pilot in World War II that flew the P-51s or the Corsairs or the P-47s or the P-40s or the P-38 Lightning. They did not want to go to the jet. They just didn't trust it. I want a prop out in front of my airplane. You might not think that now because of the F-86. And by doing so, the pilot said, wow, if Hoover can do that type of stuff on a short runway in very tough conditions, I can do it on a long runway. And he even went out on bombing missions with them as a civilian. And in a conversation with Mr. Hoover one evening over dinner after an air show, we point blank said, "Mr. Hoover, out of all the airplanes you've flown, what is your favorite?" Without hesitation, Bob Hoover said the F-86. And I guess it was just that of all the airplanes that he tested, that was the one that was looking into the future. That's the way the future was going to be. The airplanes flying for you now are former Soviet bloc aircraft. As I mentioned to you before, they are part of, and the way to keep the airplane running and to fix it and parts and all of those things make this particular group a very large group. Now here's the T-33 again. In Canada, they manufactured a number of these as well. There were well over 6,000 of these aircraft built in total. 210 were built by Mitsubishi Industries in Japan for the Japanese, and about 656 or so built in Canada at the Canadian Car and Foundry Company. And by the way, one of the T-33s will be coming in. I'll point it out to you. A T-33 was used in the Bay of Pigs invasion, but not by us, not by the United States. It was part of the inventory left over when Castro took over, and it was actually used by the Cubans. Their passes come down to about 200 to 300 feet. There is the T-33, the stretched P-80 Shooting Star. P-80 had wing tanks like this aircraft did, but they were slung underneath the wingtips rather than blending into the wingtips. When you see one up close, usually at a museum is about the only time you'll get a chance to see one. They have a completely different look than the stretch version or the T-33. They did quite a bit more aerodynamics. The T-33 just looks a little more natural as a two-place airplane than the P-80 Shooting Star does. And it's still a mystery why Lockheed didn't sweep the wings on that P-80 Shooting Star, their first jet, but it might have been because the captured German aerodynamical data that was shared between the USSR and us was not made public yet. It's ironic that the highest scoring ace of World War II, Richard bomber era, were over. There's a lot of different good reasons for that. One is controllability in a crosswind situation, and the other one is the fact that you can just plain see better when the tail of the airplane is up in the air rather than resting on a tail wheel. So for visibility and crosswind directions and crosswind capability, the tricycle gear was far superior, and that was going to be our world exclusively. Several of the airplanes and the bombers, however, in World War II did have a nose wheel, but not each and every one of them, not all of them. Okay, the airplane touching down in front of you now is again the great success story of Lockheed, the trainer airplane. The T-bird, the T-33, Canadian CT-33 Silver Star was what they named the aircraft. All of these, or many of these aircraft now, are in civilian hands, and it broke my heart. We were flying contract work out to the Channel Islands on the Navy bases several years ago, and there were a number of T-33s out there painted up in orange day glow. And while we spent the day out at the islands waiting to shuttle the workers back and forth from the Navy facility out there, I asked somebody, why are they painted in that color? They said, well, that airplane is destined to die. It's a radio-controlled airplane, and we use it as a target to test our missiles. And it broke my heart. But for an airplane that had quite a number in the inventory and were stored out in the desert, they gave their very soul, their very being. They sacrificed their very being for the improvement of ground-to-air missiles. So if you have to go for your country, that may be a way to go. Down to your right now is one of the versions of the L-29. All right, thank you, Rob. Rob says there is an F-4 Phantom at Phillips 66 Plaza from Tyndall Air Force Base that arrived the other day when the General Cherry and I were talking. F-4s forever.
And it's one of those QF-4s that will also die at the pointy end of a missile.